Now I'm going to tell you about the input container functionality. The plugin supports adding a grid of rebindable inputs to your menu. Before I show you how to do this, I first have to show you how to configure the UINF controller's data tables. So I'm going to go to my tutorial PC. I'm going to go to my UINF PC component and open the UINF controller section. And here you will find 4 data tables. These are the icon and name data tables for both the gamepad and the keyboard and mouse. So I'm going to use as the gamepad key icon data the Xbox icon, and then for the keyboard mouse key icon, the keyboard mouse icon table, then the Xbox name table, and then the keyboard mouse name table. So the way this works is the plugin will try to associate a key with an icon by searching the icon table. If it can't find an icon, it will search for a name in the equivalent data table. And if it can't find a name, it will just use that key's display name. In order to associate a key with an icon, I'm going to create a new data table in the miscellaneous category. It's going to be from the input name mapping because I want to associate it with a name. And I'm going to call it my name table. And so the way this works is you have to add a row, and that row must have the name of the input, but the under the hood name of that key. And you can find these names in the input core type.cpp file, which is inside the engine source code folder. I'm going to copy one from the existing data tables that the plugin comes with. I'm going to go to the Xbox icon table. I'm going to search for the right shoulder button name, which is this name. I'm going to copy it here. And then I'm going to add the new name of this key, which I'm going to call RB, because I'm assuming this is an Xbox controller. Now I'm just going to change the gamepad key name to my name table. And the data tables are configured. Now let's actually add our input container to our widget. So our tutorial widget is empty right now. I'm going to add an input container. In order to set up the input container's navigation, I have to append a 2D grid. And in order to feed the X and Y dimension, I can simply get the input container's keys per input, and then the number of inputs. And there you go. Now let's get into the parameters of the input container. The first thing I'm going to talk about is the action and axis names. So here you'll just create an array of the action and axis that you want the player to be able to rebind. In this case, I'm going to use the jump and fire input, which by the way I have added in the meantime to the project. You didn't see that, but I did. If I go to the input section of the project, you can see here the jump and fire input, which is mapped to, the jump is mapped to the spacebar and the face button bottom, and the fire is mapped to the left mouse button and the right shoulder. So I want to be able to rebind both these actions, and keep in mind that you can also let the player rebind the menu action keys and they'll still work. Keep in mind that the axis rebinding feature is only partially implemented, which means that you can only rebind access to non-binary keys, like the triggers or the analog sticks on the gamepad, and you cannot rebind it to binary keys like a keyboard key. Here you just specify the name you want the plugin to show when a key is empty, so that the player can add a new key. The target column is simply the column you want the player to navigate to when navigating to this input container. And then we have the input restrictions. So the input restrictions will dictate a few things. First of all, it will dictate how many different keys you want to rebind for each input. You can rebind from 1 to 3 keys, and if the input restrictions array is empty, the plugin will automatically add a none restriction, and if there are more than 3 restrictions, the plugin will remove all the restrictions starting at the 4th one. The possible restrictions are none, keyboard, mouse, keyboard and mouse, and gamepad. So I'm going to add a none and a keyboard and mouse restriction. So let's see what that looks like. Okay, so I have the jump action and the fire action, and they are mapped to these keys. So given that the first column has a none restriction, I can remap this key to whatever I want, but the second one has a keyboard and mouse restriction. So if I try to rebind the jump key to the Y key, nothing happens because that key doesn't respect the restriction. But if I map it to, say, the control key, it'll work because that key respects the restriction. Another thing to note is that the player won't be able to replace a key with another key that is already being used somewhere in the input container. So if I try to remap this key to the space key, that's not going to happen because the space key is already being used by another input. And if I try to use the RB key, which is already mapped to the same input, that's not going to be used either because it's being used by the same input. Finally, the can cancel keybind boolean dictates whether the menu return action cancels the keybind or not. So if you try to rebind a key that is mapped to the menu return key as a new key, and this boolean is set to true, that will simply cancel the rebind. And if this isn't set to true, it will still use that key for the rebind. Keep in mind that you should only have one input container in your UI nav widget. If you try to have 2 of them, you will get an error. And finally, you can reset your inputs to their default state. So this is a UI nav blueprint function library function, and you can call this to reset your inputs to the way they were. The way this works is, on begin play, your UI nav controller will look for the UINav settings.ini file, which contains the default inputs for your project. If it doesn't exist, it will create one with the current inputs. When you choose to reset the inputs to their default state, the plugin will replace the current inputs with those found in that UINav settings.ini file. And this UINav settings.ini file is located in your saved config Windows, in my case, and then you will find it right there. So it's simply a list of all the inputs in your project. Keep in mind that before you package your project, you should always delete this file so that the plugin can create it with the most up-to-date inputs. And that's really it for the input container.